And now a reading from Pixels 2470. Yea, and she said unto them, There shall be three wise elements in the mighty trinity of exposure, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the holy ISO. And it was good. Good morrow, brothers and sisters, and welcome to Professional Photography Tips.
My name is Josh Cripps, and you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Joshua Cripps Photography. Of the 3 points in the exposure triangle, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, ISO is probably the least well understood and the most incorrectly utilized. So, what does it mean, what does it do, and when is the right time to adjust it? Well, ISO stands for Interoscillating Systematized Opopotamus, and I think it's pretty clear what that means. All ISO represents is your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the camera is, so the less light it needs to make a good photo. Conversely, the lower the ISO, the less sensitive the camera is, and the more light it needs to make a good exposure. If you're familiar with my teacup analogy, you can think of ISO as the size of the cup you're filling up. The higher the ISO, the smaller the cup, so the less water is needed to fill it up. Which means we have 3 ways of affecting our photo's exposure. By adjusting the aperture, which controls depth of field. By adjusting the shutter speed, which controls motion within the photo. Or by adjusting the ISO, which controls... Wait, what does ISO control? Creatively speaking, essentially nothing, which is why for 90% of your shots, you should set your ISO to its lowest native setting and forget about it. At this low setting, you get the highest dynamic range and the least amount of noise, which is to say the best image quality. So it's a good place to be. But if it doesn't have a specific creative effect, there has to be some other reason ISO is included in your camera, right? And there is. ISO can be adjusted in order to manipulate one of the other exposure settings, aperture, or most commonly, shutter speed. In other words, you can change your ISO in order to target a specific shutter speed. Let me give you an example. Let's just say I'm shooting albatross in the French frigate shoals, and I want to freeze them in midair, capturing all the details of their feathers. I put my camera in aperture priority and select f5.6 for a good compromise between depth of field and subject isolation. I'm at ISO 100, and in order to get a good exposure, the camera selects a shutter speed of 1/160. Now, this sounds fast, but when I take a photo, it's full of motion blur. Poop. But now I know I can manipulate my shutter speed with a little tweak of the ISO. So if I crank it up 3 stops to ISO 800, which makes the camera much more sensitive to light, it has no choice but to speed up the shutter speed by those same 3 stops in order to compensate. And that gives me a new shutter speed of 1/1250th of a second, which is much faster. And now when I snap a pic, the details are razor sharp. Now how about something completely different? Let's say I'm out at Mono Lake at night and I want to shoot the star field just as I see it with those thousands of bright pinpoints. Now, believe it or not, this is actually the exact same idea as the albatross shoot, just on a different scale. If my camera's at f8 and ISO 100, I'd need a shutter speed of 17,000 seconds to get a good exposure. That's almost 5 hours. So how can I shorten my shutter speed? Exactly right, by increasing my ISO. By upping it to ISO 400, I was able to bring the shutter speed down from 5 hours to just 74 minutes, which gave me a look like this. But that's still not pinpoint, so I need to decrease the shutter speed even further, again by increasing my ISO. By cranking it up to 12,800, as well as opening up the aperture a little bit to let in some more light, I was able to get it down to 15 seconds, and finally, I got my pinpoints. Just be aware that increasing your ISO like this does come at a cost of an increased amount of noise or grain in your photo, which reduces dynamic range and detail in your images. Just like everything else in photography, there's always a trade-off. And there you have it, ISO in a nutshell. Leave it alone most of the time unless you're targeting a specific shutter speed. Now, in the last few minutes I talked about targeting faster shutter speeds, but what if you want to target a slower shutter speed in order to increase the amount of motion in your photo? Well, you can check out this video about using neutral density filters to do just that. And if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel and join my newsletter for all kinds of great photo tips and techniques. Or if you'd like to learn photography with me in person, you can join me in an on-location photography workshop at sea2summitworkshops.com. Until next time, have fun and happy shooting.